But before we get started learning Touchdesigner, what it is and how it works, maybe a quick idea of what it can do. One example being, it's a brilliant 2D and 3D visualization tool. So this is from a VJ sort of setup, if you will. It uses audio to drive the shapes and the patterns that we're seeing, all of which are being remixed in real time using a combination of 2D and 3D, as well as geometry, as well as textures and information driven by external sources such as audio. It can be used as a complex 3D modeling tool, as well as realistic lighting and shadow simulation. In this example, we've got geometry interacting with 3 lights that are moving in sequence. You can see that it creates this beautiful, realistic, real-time view. It can also integrate with external Python libraries without the need to visually code or connect anything. This uses this searches Twitter using their API to get results for the hello tag. And then from there, you can draw everything from people's Twitter profile pictures through to their handle, all the way through to the text that they used. And finally, you can make complex interactive UI solutions. And this, for example, is an encoder that takes your video or your image sequences and allow you to encode it into the HAPQ or an H.265 format for super high quality playback without the memory bandwidth. So Touchdesigner is a super versatile and powerful tool. And the reality is that if you want it to be able to do something, you will be able to make it do it. But that boundless scope is also its main limiting power. And that's what the goal of this upcoming tutorial series is to teach you how to manage, manipulate, and learn how to do everything that you could possibly want to do in Touchdesigner. Whereas at the moment, a majority of tutorials and guides, in my opinion, focus on solving specific problems rather than educating a user in what they need to know to develop their own Touchdesigner installations, interactions, visualizations, programs, anything. So, let's get started. Episode 1, Lesson 1. Let's get started. Lesson 1, Part 1. What is Touchdesigner? Lesson 1, Part 2, the user interface. When you start Touchdesigner, we'll be given a fairly basic. When you start Touchdesigner, it can be fairly overwhelming to begin with if you're used to developing in conventional programming and development environments. There's a lot going on and there's a lot to understand what's happening. So let's take it from the top to the bottom and work out what we're looking at. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to close this thing called the Pallet Browser. That's basically a library of pre-made components for Touchdesigner that we'll come back to in a later tutorial. Like any program running on Windows or Mac, you're going to get access to file, edit, dialogues, and help. File is going to allow you to open, close, or save whatever you're working with. Edit is going to give you the option to search your network for something. Search is all you're going to do is that search. Preferences are going to give you access to the sort of the greater Touchdesigner controls. But we'll come back to this as and when we need it further down the line. But just know that this allows you to control the finer details that you wouldn't want to deal with programmatically, such as do you want any of these purple boxes to be limited in terms of resolution? So quarter, for example, if I had a bad graphics card, or the computer I was using didn't have a graphics card. I'm going to set that back. And then obviously you have help. Help is going to be your saver for most things, but each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each node that we'll look at in a minute, each when you first start Touchdesigner, it can be quite daunting with what you have in front of you. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of the user interface and how to use it, we're going to explore the basic concept that is Touchdesigner. And that is a real-time visual programming language that works in a pipe. For example, out is the end of a pipe, and it is controlling everything else in its path using what we call a calling or a cooking feature. So this out is looking back through this chain like a program that runs left to right, but top to bottom is not a space that you work in. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, we need to understand how Touchdesigner operates. And the easiest way to visualize it is in a pipe. So everything runs left to right, no matter how many connections, up and down, whatever you do, left to right. So in this example, out is the end of the pipe. And out is actually what is controlling everything else in here. Touchdesigner runs in a time-based format, frames. So up here we can see my patch is running at 60 frames per second and real time is set, which basically means I'm asking it to try and cook every single frame. You can see if I disable that, the displace appears to run much faster, and that's because it's now running at way beyond real time. My laptop in this scene is probably running at something like 200 frames a second. So real time means that everything in here is cooking at 60 frames per second. And the act of cooking is the process of Touchdesigner processing everything in its pipeline. Inside dialogues, we have something called the performance monitor, where we can analyze how long it takes for Touchdesigner to process an entire pipeline. And in the case we have in front of us, it takes 6.4 milliseconds to go from here to here, processing everything. Each node, or each action inside the network, is broken down into a little bit more detail, but all we need to know is how long does it take for Touchdesigner to render a frame, and that is called cooking. Out, the end of our pipeline, is the driver for our frame. Touchdesigner will not cook a node unless it's directly in a chain that's asking for it. So it will start at the end and say, okay, geometry is out is asking for this geometry, so it will cook it. This geometry relies on this displacement, so it will cook that. And this displacement relies on this movie file in and this object called a chop2. This chop2 relies on something called this noise. So Touchdesigner works in a reverse single pipeline where it will start at the end and go back and work out what needs to cook. So if I was to introduce something like this movie file in, even though it's rendering on our window, it's not actually involved in our pipeline, and therefore it's not going to be cooking. And by not cooking, it's not taking up system resources. There are a few caveats about cooking and performance that we'll get into further down the line, but all you need to know for now is that if it's connected to something, Touchdesigner is probably going to process it, and if you do something that's very intensive or super heavy, it will take time. So, what is this user interface we're looking at? Well, obviously, we have this grid pattern in the background that's called the network. And in that network are a bunch of nodes that are referred to as operators inside Touchdesigner. There are loads of different types of operators that we'll get to as time takes us there. But the 6 main types are something called a comp. A comp is the idea of a container or a bucket for something larger. For example, a camera comp contains a special camera file that allows Touchdesigners to read 3D geometry data. Whereas something like a button contains an interactive button that we can toggle on and off using a mouse click. Comps make up a large part of this tutorial, so I'm not going to bog you down with the detail on them just now. Just know that they are important. Tops. Tops stand for texture operator, and these are one of the main things that you're going to benefit from inside Touchdesigner. as it runs in real time, it allows us to both process and manipulate textures, e.g. images, files, 2D geometry, anything that we want, basically 2D motion graphics, all in real time, all inside here. There are ways to create textures, as well as ways to manipulate textures. Chops will be section 2 of this tutorial series. After chops, we have the green icons known as chops, and these are channel operators. And the simplest way to think of these are anything that involves data that isn't a texture. So, as we can see on the left, a chop can be noise that happens over a long period of time, in this case 120 samples, or it can be a single value that we manipulate and control somewhere in our program. Chops can allow us to bring in audio, allow us to control and manipulate audio, as well as play out to an external device. Sorry. Chops are going to be where we handle any data that we want to, whether we're interacting with our screen, a button, a controller, or we're analyzing audio or creating random generated ramps. Chops are section 3 in this tutorial. Next, we have SOPs, and they partner with DATs, with MATs. SOPs are shape operators, and they are the basic forms of 3D geometry. So, whereas a top is a 2D texture, a SOP is a 3D material. A SOP is a 3D shape in a local space. Okay. Again, you have the ability to create 3D geometry and then manipulate it. However you want. SOPs partner with MATs, which are known as material operators. They primarily allow us to apply something such as They allow us to combine something like our 2D texture operators with our 3D geometry, where we can take a shape and apply it as if it were a texture on that material. There are lots of options when it comes to using materials, but we'll cover them more specifically when we look at SOPs. The final section here is called DAT. A data operator is slightly different than anything else, whereas more allows us to augment everything else that we have inside Touchdesigner. It allows us to take data inside our Touchdesigner environment and turn it into programmatic data. For example, this chop2 DAT takes this noise data and turns it into a text representation of the 120 channels here. So you can see there's 120 rows. So this is a side-on view, whereas this is a scrolling list view of everything inside here. DATs allow us to access the true power of Touchdesigner and influence the Python library or the Python integration underneath the surface. That is a very specific part of this tutorial series, and we will come back to that later. But for now, just know that DATs are very powerful, and we're most likely not going to use them until we're more familiar with using Touchdesigner. Now, if you've ever programmed before, which hopefully you have if you're coming into this, you'll be wondering, well, how do we control and manipulate things as if they were a function, an object, or a library? Well, the benefit of Touchdesigner is that not only is it a pipeline system of left to right, it also works in a sandwich tier system known as containers. So at the moment, when we're working using our navigator at the top here, we're inside the Project 1 container. If I scroll out, you'll see that Project 1 is a container that from the outside looks like the final output of that render pipeline if I go back to our original model. This is essentially, this should be sort of thought of as a function. It is a self-containing piece of code that we can go into, access, and control from anywhere, but it is distinctly separate from the rest of the program. Like in programming, you can subset containers within containers. So you can have containers within containers and within containers. And if we load something like our encoder again and remove it from its interface view, we can see that this is essentially a large number of containers, all communicating and doing very specific purposes as a function or an object would inside a more conventional programming environment. And I hinted on it at the start of this program, at the start of this lesson, but Touchdesigner is so powerful because it's a real-time performance tool. Everything that we ask it to do is happening very specifically in a real-time space. And by real-time space, I mean that every second is based on a frame counter, and every frame is built on a timeline. Each container can have its own independent timeline that we can control and manipulate as we need. For example, we could have a movie in a container. Let me load something with time. We can have a movie in a container that is running, but it can also have its own independent timeline that we can stop. So if I set play to 0, time in this container will have stopped, but on the main level we can still see our noise is generating, whereas if it was stopped here, it would also not be moving. This is a very powerful concept, the ability to have multiple different timelines, time world spaces, all running independently from the master timeline. This again is a large part of this tutorial and understanding the power of Touchdesigner, so we'll be covered in some detail throughout this entire series. The final part of the introduction to Touchdesigner and understanding how to work with it is the idea of the performance mode. So I said at the beginning of this lesson that in this pipeline only these items were cooking because they were connected. But that's not necessarily true, because if I restart time in my other container, even though this window is not connected to this chain, it is still currently rendering at 60 frames per second. And that is because it is currently visible. Touchdesigner includes something called the perform mode, which is normally accessed by pressing F1. This takes Touchdesigner out of its development modes and puts it into a mode specifically placed for optimized playback. In here, anything that is no longer visible is not being cooked. And that very specifically means that your pipelines take full effect, and those time controls I mentioned earlier become even more powerful. Perform mode can be used to span windows over 20 displays, 10 projectors, allow you to control multiple devices from one space, all while fully optimizing your developed network. Optimization will probably be the very last stage inside this tutorial series, but it's something to understand that we can use perform mode by accessing something called a window and linking our containers to it. But we'll make more sense of what linking and how to access all of them when we get started working with our data. Lesson 2. Getting started with tops. So the most obvious place to get started inside Touchdesigner is with 2D textures. It's the core of the program and what you're going to be doing most until you get into a programmatic uses of it. Inside Touchdesigner, we have the option to both create, manipulate, and import 2D textures from almost anywhere, whether it be a pre-existing file, movie, image, GIF, a website, anything. You can even create them inside Touchdesigner as you want. So I'm going to get started by double-clicking anywhere in my network, and it's going to pop up the operator creating dialog. I'm going to navigate to top, and in here you should see we have a plethora of different styles that allow us to do anything from get videos from external devices, bring in movie files, all the way through to coded shader language. To keep it simple for us, I'm going to create a circle. And I'm also going to bring in a movie file. And I want to bring in, let's say, a nice background here. So inside Touchdesigner, I now have two individual 2D textures that I can find out a lot of information about. Looking at my circle again, I'm going to have a look at this over here, which is called my parameter window. If it's not visible, please push P on your keyboard. Inside here, because this is a creation of an asset, I have a load of options on what I can do with it. Whether it be manipulating its size, rotating it, I don't know why that would help a circle, or changing its center inside the window. Inside the softness tab, I can blur it out a little bit, and then offset that softness. Change the style of calculation. And finally, in Common tab, a tab that every object has, no matter what it be you're loading, allows me to control the resolution as well as the output aspect ratio of the object inside the texture itself. So by default, it's going to create a 256 by 256 square that uses the input, aka 1:1, as the aspect ratio. But I have a 1080p display, so why wouldn't we set that to 1080p? And you can see that now I've changed from having a square to a rectangular box. I can find more information about what's happening inside here by clicking my middle mouse over the box. And it's going to show me a bunch of information about how long it takes to cook it, aka how long does it render, less than 2 milliseconds, the size of it, its aspect ratio, as well as any color data that's going on inside of it. Really interestingly, it also tells me how much GPU memory is being used inside Touchdesigner. So now I've made my circle, we can look at our movie file in and tell the same thing. So if I push my middle mouse button, I can see that this movie that I've loaded is a 1280 by 720p texture that has a 16 by 9 aspect ratio. It's currently taking 3 megabytes of data, and to load it, it took 19 milliseconds. And the reason it took so long is purely because that was the first load of the image, and there's nothing else in the pipeline, so it's not actually repeatedly rendering this screen. Now, one of the best things we can do is connect everything in a pipeline, like when we first started Touchdesigner. So I can either double click and add something like, let's say I'm going to add a level. That's not the right object. So add a level, and then I can drag and click and connect one object to the other. And now I'll see that my image has appeared inside the level, and I can use its tabs to control the data. And in here, I want to sample out just the blue data from my image. So I'm going to turn my RGB colors down. So now if I turn them all down, I'd have a black image. Green means I'd have green, red means I'd have red, etc. But I want blue. So instantly, I've taken my image, manipulated it, and now we can see we're getting to, it takes less than 0.006 of a millisecond to cook. So even though the first load was super intense, it's actually taking essentially nothing. Like, we as humans couldn't measure it to be able to get it to work. But That can be a bit complicated, and unless you know exactly what you want to make, there's a lot of options here on what does and doesn't work. So one tip is that if you go to the right hand side, what we call the outlets and inlets, highlight the outlets so that they are illuminated and right click. It will then bring up a window that will have only, you can see how depth, DirectX and movie file in are no longer selectable. That's because they will not partner with level. So anything that is still highlighted is theoretically could work on a level top out. So let's analyze it. You can see that I can get my minimum, maximum and average luminance, screen, red, etc. It's just a good way to analyze the data that's coming out the top. So I'm going to delete that. Now I'm creating some weird art. So I want some way to put these on top of each other. And if you've ever done any sort of video editing or photo editing before, you know that the term we're looking for is composite. I'm going to add a composite operator and add both of my instances to it. Now, inside here, we're doing a multiply operation. And if you have ever done any editing, you'll know that a multiply is effectively going to add a mask on white. So my faded 1080p circle is actually going to apply a nice vignette to this image, or it's going to vignette this image, I should say. The order that the operators are coming in is important to achieving this effect. In this exact example, it doesn't make a difference, but if I were to say add, or a top, put one on top of the other, the order in which the operators are entering the texture or entering the composite operator is important to determining the outcome. Now, without knowing the sort of action you want to do, this can be very confusing. So on these multi-selection tops, Touchdesigner gives us the brilliant option to preview. And it gives us a very quick overview of two images per drop down, depending on the order that they come in. So for example, this one is, so you can see if I do add in either order, it looks the same, and that's what this is showing us. Whereas the second one is showing us a top bit in either order, so this being the current order and that being the alternate order. Well, it's not a perfect system. It's very good to understand that you can preview what you're working with, and that texture order is going to be important anytime you manipulate data. Now, I don't want to go too deep into something like compositing, but normally if you're putting two images on top of each other, which you will do a lot, it will be via a composite operator that you do it, whether it be multiply, a top, add, over. That's for your creative preference, and it can do almost anything that you would need it to. But for now, I think I want to move on and start introducing the idea of video. So I have a collection of assets that I downloaded from the internet, whether they be GIFs, images, or videos. All of them can be drag and dropped into the Touchdesigner interface and will play or load dynamically. Videos, specifically videos and GIFs, rely on the timeline to control how they play back. Touchdesigner will dynamically understand that we want to, by default, see our video at the correct playback rate, and it will work out what our current frames per second is, what the frames per second of the video is, and then do some sort of quick maths to work out how many frames it should play a second of your video to play it back at the correct rate. If I middle click on any of my videos, or my GIFs, or even my image, you can see that we have something called a sample rate. And sample rate is effectively its frame per second. My GIF being 12.5 frames per second, and my video being 29.97 frames per second. These will differ from formats that you bring in, whether it be something you've rendered or an online source that you've required, but it's important to know that Touchdesigner will automatically calculate how to play it back based on the sequential play mode. We can alter it by telling it to play a specific index, or by locking it to timeline. And using those independent timelines we learned about earlier, we can have advanced control over our videos and how they play back, whether we want it to be slow, fast, or play at a different order, or play specifically at the times that we want it to. Using a container with a timeline in a video, we will get advanced control over a video, but again, we will come back to that in a more advanced lesson. The final thing that Touchdesigner can handle is the idea of image sequences. So the final option is that Touchdesigner can also load and handle image sequences. So navigating to our folder again, all I'm going to do is I'm going to select one of the images in my folder and push open. I'm then going to delete the file name in .jpeg and push enter. And now Touchdesigner will be using our folder as an image sequence. In here, inside play, you're going to want to speed up how it works, because at the moment it will play 1 frame per 1 frame a second. So if we know it's 12.5, I'm going to speed up to 12.5 using this as my calculator. And in theory, these should now be playing in perfect sync, even though one is saved as a GIF and the other is saved as an image sequence. I'm going to use a chop info to visualize something for you. So looking at them side by side, we can see that thanks to the size of this file, there's almost no depreciation in performance while using an image sequence. But 9 out of 10 times, loading a video is going to be more efficient inside a Touchdesigner environment than loading an image sequence. It's just to do with it starts relying on hard drive processing time rather than image processing time. But there we go. So Touchdesigner bringing in images, image sequences, videos, as well as GIFs. It's a super powerful tool that you can then use in all of your 2D animations and performances. And that brings us on to Lesson 2, Part 3, the real-time image manipulation. We already just started exploring it while we were looking at 2D asset creation, but Touchdesigner and its tops alone have a plethora of powerful tools to allow us to manipulate images on top of each other. The first one obviously being composite, whereas if we were to do something like this is our background, and then I want my walking girl on top of it. Now I want the layer that has the girl walking to be on top, so I'm going to change the scale or change the order. You see that manipulates our component resolution. It makes it a 1920 by 1080 display because this is now second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the transform layer. I do want my background top to be the resolution, but for the prefit overlay, I'm going to do native resolution. And that means that now the girl coming in is going to stay at her native resolution and aspect ratio, and we'll still maintain our 1920 1080p aspect ratio. I do need to scale her down a bit though. Now, really annoyingly is her white background is causing a lot of issues with our alpha. If I do a top, you'll see that she's sitting there. So why don't we do a level? So one way to remove the background would be with a Chroma Key, effectively removing pure white values. It's dirty, but it is very quick, and it's probably the most efficient way for us to be able to do what we want to do. Where now we have our woman and her background removed on the image. Using things such as a GLSL shader that we write ourselves, or perhaps channel mix. Because of the amount of white data inside her herself, it becomes very complicated if we want to remove data without damaging her. So for now, this is what will work. In transform, I'm going to move her position slightly, so she's walking on this ledge over here, and scale her down a bit more. So already we've taken an animation, brought it in, and applied it in a real-time 2D texture setting. All of this happening at 60 frames per second thanks to the brilliant flowing of Touchdesigner. Now let's go back to our sun example, or our circle example, sorry, and let's turn it into a sun. So I'm actually going to reset this completely by doing right-click, reset all parameters. I'm going to give it a bit of softness again, and then push it out a bit with a linear curve. So we have almost like this sun-esque look. Now, a normal way you would change the color is literally by changing the fill color. But I want slightly more control over it, so I'm going to right click and I'm going to add a level top. So I want slightly more control over it, so I'm going to add a constant that is the color I want. In this case I'm going to do a brilliant orange, and I'm going to composite it on top of my circle using a multiply. So now I have a pure white circle taking my orange color. Now that seems about right, so I'm going to add another comp using my image and this. But again, we need to sort our aspect ratio, and I'm going to transform it into the right place. This way we retain all the quality of this without having to transform this into a tiny size, or make this a 1080 shape that has a 1080p shape with a tiny circle in the top right corner. Brilliant. Okay, let's add some sun rays to this. So for that, instead of a circle, I'm going to use a rectangle. If that's what it's called, rectangle. Now I want this to be super long and very thin, and I'm going to rotate it by 45 degrees. Make it a bit longer. So now I have this brilliant sun ray. And the reason we use a constant rather than just changing the color of our circle is that I want to be able to guarantee that I get the right color for everything. So now I can simply just comp my rectangle on top of my color again. To do that, I'm going to copy and paste my comp, drag and drop my cable, and literally just replace that circle by making sure it highlights orange, yellow. When it does, you can let go and it will replace the existing connection. Okay. A rectangle doesn't allow us to blur it the same way that we can with a circle, so I'm going to introduce a blur just to give it a softer edge. This could be super intensive, so just be careful with using this. And now I'm going to add that. I'm going to add a channel mix, drop its opacity slightly, and then comp this into my scene. Again, I'm going to do a top. Now, thinking about it, I probably want my sunbeam to appear under my sun. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invert the order that these come in. I'm going to add my sun. I'm going to delete this inlet and move this back one in the chain. Plug in my backgrounds and then replace where my background goes into the main scene. And now my sun is underneath my composite. This just allows us to control it without having to go back and fiddle with the sun. This looks good to me. And I'm going to leave my sun ray at native resolution. And then I am going to introduce a transform, lift these up slightly. I want my transform to come at the very end. And I'm actually going to rotate this again and lift it up slightly. And then I'm also going to add that to the same comp where we had the first sun ray. Bring it above. Now we have a problem where our fixed layer can only be input 1 or input 2, but our resolution is coming from our third input. So I'm going to manually set the data here by going to comment, custom resolution, set our data, and I'm going to use resolution as my aspect ratio definer. Perfect. I'm going to change my transform to be fit. Let's go fit native again. And I'm going to change my composite type to add. Sorry, a top means that it's only going to put one on top of the other, and we just couldn't visualize the third. So now I have my single color and single rectangle driving two different sunbeams thanks to the addition of pipelining in Touchdesigner. So one comes in and then a second comes in. We could even add a third by plugging it in the same way, lifting it above our background, and then rotating it even in a different way. Again, I'm going to offset it so it appears. I'm going to rotate it even further, move it along slightly. Now, to get this quick access menu, I'm holding my middle mouse button over the variable, and keeping it held, I'm moving up and down, and that allows me to change my values by 10, 1, 0.1, 0.01, or 0.001 unit values at a time by scrolling left and right. Now, it's all a bit intense now that I've got three on top of each other. So I'm going to go into my channel mix, turn down my alpha even more. Let's do 0.75, 0.75, and 0.75. So there you go. That's taking just a little bit of intensity out of our colors. By changing the color of my shape, I could, by making it closer to gray, I could also make them darker because this comp with multiply is based on white values. Or I could just control the alpha value of my shape altogether. But a good practice is to use gray values black to white to control multiplication. Now we have an amazing sun, 3 sunbeams on top of our animated real-time image.